So establishment media now has a new attack against people who are protesting for left-wing causes. Now, specifically for energy infrastructure, which basically means pipelines, right? Now, this newest piece against the left is in McClatchy, who not only attacks RT during this segment, but also goes on to smear Tim Canova, who's a progressive, and the protests against natural gas pipelines. So, now, they start out by saying that RT, and going after, of course, RT, which is used to be Russia Today, which, yes, is Russian-funded state media, and let's be honest about that. Yes, they are funded by the Russian government. Nonetheless, they say that RT was there in Florida during a pipeline protest to provide global news coverage of one of 5, in their words, not RT's words, but this is McClatchy's words, unremarkable rallies across Florida. Unremarkable? What is unremarkable about pipeline protests? I don't quite understand, but again, you have to look at the framing. Now, these rallies, they say, were aimed at turning the public against a nearly completed $3 billion natural gas pipeline. So they're setting this up as, here you go, Russian state media that's covering pipeline protests. And what's the problem? RT has covered other pipeline protests. They covered the Keystone XL. They covered Dakota Access. And they will likely cover other pipeline protests as well. You know why? It's because those protests are actually newsworthy. Now, to give RT a little bit of credit here, they covered what American media has refused to cover. So what's the problem with that? Well, Greg Gordon, who wrote this article, goes on to say what the problem is, in his estimation, not mine. Quote, what the demonstrators didn't know was that so-called Russian internet trolls had been busy for 2 weeks encouraging people to turn out for the protests with posts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. They used phony-sounding American identities, such as Stephen Cook and Amelie Baldwin. So now they're saying, oh, look at that. Here we go. We've got Russian internet trolls using fake American names that are against a pipeline. That pipeline, but that's a good old American pipeline that's going to carry natural gas. And it's going to make a corporation, a private American corporation, a lot of money. Oh, the horror. The horror! No, you know what you need to do? We need to expose these terrible Russian communists, which aren't actually communists. It's amazing that people don't know that Russia is no longer communist. They're actually hyper-capitalist, and they're more of an oligarchy than anything. But anyway, so, we need to expose these pipeline protesters for being useful Russian tools, or perhaps even Russian agents. Now Gordon continues. Russia's hidden hand in the Florida pipeline protests was extensive. According to sources familiar with the operations, at least 8 Russian accounts, 8, most tied to the troll farm known as the Internet Research Agency, sent at least 16 social media messages excoriating the Sabal Trail pipeline or retweeting messages from one of its most prominent opponents, a frequent guest on RT. Oh my God. So a guest that goes on RT and talks about how bad the pipeline is now getting retweeted by Russian bots when he talks about how bad the pipeline is. That's your evidence, man. That's your big thing. Wow. Now, the tweets were sent to a total of more than 40,000 followers, as well as anyone who might have saw them via hashtags. So look, that specific example of just as a ball type pipeline, and of course, they've got another example of other social media, right? Which they sent thousands of social media messages, right? So they want to say that, oh, this reach, this is huge. This is huge. This is a big deal. Look at all these. Look at how these Russian bots are influencing America. And really, the whole point is from them is look at how divisive, how they're dividing Americans. But wait a minute, you can't really exploit a division in America if we weren't already divided over these issues. So I'm just saying. But look, I would actually be more impressed if it reached more people. And actually, I would want those messages to reach more people because more pipelines are actually bad news. Pipelines leak, and they also, when they're fully functional, they carry this natural gas or oil or, in the case of Dakota Access, tar sands or Dakota Access Keystone, that tar sands oil, which ends up adding a lot of carbon into the atmosphere. And at a time where climate change continues to get worse, and basically the window that we can avoid the worst parts of climate change continues to close. So we're going way past that 2 degrees Celsius mark that we should be aiming for. We're going way past that, and that's, again, that is not good news for the planet, or specifically for us on the planet. No. Here's where we get to the point of this article. This is the reason that they wrote it. Quote, the social media propaganda was part of a broad Kremlin campaign to disrupt the booming American energy industry, which seemingly overnight has emerged as a threat to Russia's global dominance, U.S. authorities say. So this is stenography. So this guy, Greg Gordon, writing from McClatchy, goes to the government and says, okay, look, we got these pipeline protests. And the government says, Russia. It's the Russians. All they're trying to do is they're trying to shut down our booming energy agencies, our booming energy industries. Sorry. Because they're challenging Russia, and we have to beat Russia so our American corporations can make more profit. So here's the framing. If you're not for American pipelines, if you're not for fossil fuels, then you're a Russian agent. You're with the Russians, or you are being a useful idiot and a tool for Russian interests. Now, look, does Russia have a vested interest in becoming a fossil fuel exporter? Yeah, just like most countries that have large fossil fuel reserves. You want to become an exporter, you want to go and sell it, right? Because that makes you money, and that makes American corporations money, and it also makes Russian corporations money. And look, maybe instead of doing that, right, maybe we should or maybe we should actually invest in alternative energy. Because at the end of the day, climate change doesn't care if you're a Russian or not. But this is a great example of the neo-McCarthyism going on that has been going on since the 2016 election was over. Now, if you think that if you thought that Hillary well, okay, let me start over on that one. If Trump hadn't won, do you think we'd be having this conversation about Russian trolls? Absolutely not. You're kidding me. So the only reason that we're having this conversation is because the Democrats, by and large, even though there's truth to it, to the Russia narrative, at least I believe so, they want to blame the loss, completely on Russia. So, look, I don't believe the Russians are at fault for losing Hillary Clinton in the election, and I've talked about that before. But what's going on here is that there's a couple of things. First, the corporate establishment is attempting to try or to tie left-wing causes to Russia. So by doing so, of course, they ignore the majority of grassroots support for those left-wing causes. Because it turns out we're actually a progressive country. On issue after issue, you can go down and you can see how we are progressive as a nation. Now, as I said before, I do believe that Russia did try to influence our election. You guys know that. A lot of you disagree with me, and that's fine. I think they tried to do it with bots and trolls and dank memes, which I don't think were very effective. But see, that's why I'm not worried about it as much. What I am worried about is the reaction from the establishment. And what they're doing is that they're using this to smear the entire progressive movement. And as a result, of course, a couple things do happen. The media, which is the establishment and despises the left, the actual left, is going to write off major protests going on as Russian-backed. So, look, when it came to, for example, Standing Rock, mainstream media mostly ignored it. Now, going forward, if there is another moment like that, if there is another massive protest against a pipeline, then the media, mainstream media, is going to go, you know what? Here's Russia. It's the Russians. They're Russian-backed. And then Joanne Reed is going to be all over it. Oh, look at how the Russians are opposing this pipeline. They're going after American energy independence. How dare they? How dare they? That's one of the things, right? Now, another unfortunate effect is that it gets people who might actually support these causes originally and aren't very well versed in the news and things like that to think, wait a minute, Russians, if the Russians are backing this, and the Russians are our geopolitical foe, which, again, that's another narrative being pushed in mainstream media, well then I can't back these causes. So I guess I will support the establishment instead, or not support anyone. So, and not only that, there's another thing that would happen, and that's smearing progressive leaders, smearing progressive activists, and people who are running for office. Now, case in point, Tim Canova, right? Now, Gordon mentions that Canova, who is, quote, an outspoken activist who was making a second run for Congress in Broward County, has appeared on Russian television networks at least 18 times, including the December 29, 2016 Miami protest against the pipeline. So, again, here we go. Tim Canova, Russian state TV. He must be a Russian agent in there to try and disrupt Florida politics. Tim Canova has been trying to take down Debbie Wasserman Schultz. You know, the absolutely disgraced former head of the DNC, who, if you guys remember, put her thumb, finger, hand, entire body on the scale for Hillary Clinton during the election and got fired for it. That Debbie Wasserman Schultz. So Tim Canova originally ran as a Democrat. The Democratic establishment despises him, and now in this run, he's running as an independent. And of course, establishment Democrats are like, oh, you can't do that. You can't run as an independent. Why aren't you a Democrat? And then when you're a Democrat, why are you running as a Democrat, not as an independent? You can't win with these people. And now, of course, the narrative is going to be, well, he was on RT. He must be a Russian agent. In fact, they quoted Canova in a phone interview talking about this. Since, of course, they've been making these accusations now, Canova said, quote, the protesters never welcomed or tried to get foreign powers to spread the word for us. And he also stressed that most of his appearances on RT and Sputnik, which is another state-backed Russian network, came on shows hosted by real journalists. And he's got that in quotation marks, such as former CNN talk show host Larry King. So, and look, Ed Schultz, who is also on RT as well. So these are the kinds of people that Tim Canova would talk to. These are respected figures who actually do journalism. But now you have establishment Democrats that are like, well, if you're on RT, you must be some sort of Russian agent. It's insane. Now, they also quoted Canova as saying, should I reject interviews on RT or on Fox News, for example, because some people don't like the messenger? I will say yes to just about anyone who asks me to appear. And that's what you're supposed to do. And look, again, ironically, despite being a part of Russia's network, RT has done better journalism on America than American media. And that, of course, is a good example of how our media is absolutely failing. But the smear against Canova continues. Now, they said somewhat ironically, this is back to Gordon, writing, Canova is running as an independent in a second bid to unseat Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Canova later publicly challenged the party's assertion that it had been hacked by the Russians, instead pointedly and apparently erroneously suggesting that the culprit may have been DNC high-tech worker Seth Rich. Canova has since said that he has ceased pushing that theory at the request of Seth Rich's family. Look, I don't believe in the Seth Rich conspiracy. And you guys can disagree with that, but I think it's ridiculous. But I think it's clear that the addition of this and adding in the skepticism of the Russian hacking narrative, which a lot of people do have skepticism on, is meant to smear him as some sort of Russian-backed lunatic. Again, Sean Hannity is one of the guys who was pushing the Seth Rich conspiracy as well. So, but see, Canova, I think Canova is an excellent progressive, and I think he's a guy who has been screwed over by the Democratic establishment. He's not the only person that I know that has been screwed over by the Democratic establishment, has been smeared mercilessly for being a progressive and for not basically backing the establishment. I mean, look, we've had the DCCC, for example, on tape telling progressives to get the hell out of the race. Gone. We've already chosen our candidate. Leave. I mean, we would hope that you would drop out already. But if you insist on staying in, well then make sure you don't harm our candidate. And what's the point of running a primary? Well, that's the point. Democrats don't want you to run primaries. They hate primaries. They think, no, how are we going to serve our donors if we have to actually pretend to be progressive in a primary? No, that does us no good. But here's the thing. I disagree with Tim Canova. Back to him in his tactical choice for independent, but I get why he's doing it. And that's the overall point here. Now, they also add that intelligence is watching how Russia interacts with figures like Canova. Again, another way to try to smear Canova and to try to basically ruin his chances of beating Debbie Wasserman Schultz. He's being watched by intelligence to make sure that he's not coordinating with Russia to divide people in Florida. Again, this is insanity. Now, they also have a quote from Ben Cardin here, right? Now, his staff on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee reported that Russia continues to try and capitalize on the activities of what it considers useful idiots, far-left activists and politicians in the West whose agitation aids its cause, just as the Soviet Union did. Again, if you are not clear about their perspective on people like Canova, well, they just spell it out by quoting this, saying that left-wing activists are being used as useful idiots to spread Russian propaganda. What Russian propaganda? Awareness of environmental issues? Fighting against pipelines that will actually leak or most likely end up leaking, spilling oil and natural gas, polluting the environment, and even failing that, getting burned and releasing carbon into the atmosphere, which will further exacerbate climate change. Oh my God, those dastardly Russians. Look, if this is not a way to delegitimize the left using Russiagate, I don't know what is. They also, and I remember reports of them trying to delegitimize Black Lives Matter protests by saying, Russians set those up too to divide America. Now, ironically, they write that, quote, while the Russian cyber operatives allegedly tricked several U.S. political activists into hosting election-related protests favoring Donald Trump's presidential campaign, the activists said trolls didn't instigate the Sabal Trail rallies. No, you're no kidding. You mean this is an organic rally after all? Well, why didn't you mention that 3 pages ago? Well, here's why. They add, the trolls were quick to pick up on those efforts. By mid-December, they were retweeting Canova and other protesters with automated messages known as bots, beckoning followers to attend the rallies on the 29th. They also promoted other Sabal Trail protests in early of 2017. So the protests were already set up, they were organic, but because those Russian trolls went in there and started retweeting, well, that makes the people who organized the event and participate in the event useful Russian idiots, according to this. At least that's the way that I'm reading this. So, now this got people who were actually, that are activists, that are against these pipelines, to have to defend themselves. In fact, this is Tampa activist Anita Stewart. Now, she's a one-time Air Force intelligence officer, and she said that she initiated the social media networks for Sabal Trail protesters and had created a Facebook page that had built a following of 10,000 people strong. Now, she said, quote, people could just not post on it. Their posts had to be approved because we had so many crazy people posting stuff all the time. As for Russian bot accounts, I'm not saying that didn't happen. Well, nobody's saying that didn't happen. Again, earlier, I said that Russia did try to influence the election and did try to influence Americans with social media, bots and bullshit, right? Dank memes. Nonetheless, did that have that much of an impact? I don't believe so. And does anybody who gets retweeted by a Russian bot or Russian troll account become a spreader of Russian propaganda? You've got to be kidding me if you believe that. But she says, quote, there were a lot of accounts that would come on the Facebook group that didn't have a real name. You can tell the names are fake. They don't have an address. We try to be very careful and not allow membership of those types of accounts. So what's funny is that from the perspective of the article, in trying to remain neutral while smearing these groups, this article points out that these very groups who are accused to be Russian, useful idiots and groups infected by Russians, well, they were very careful in who they admitted to those groups to make sure that none of these bots or troll accounts actually became part of that group. Now, I'm not saying Russian bots and trolls didn't try to do this. As I said before, they did. The problem here is that our media is essentially trying to conflate the two things. That the Russians who are using the left to, again, what? Push alternative energy? Well, that would be fantastic. How is that a bad thing? But then Russia, they say, will have an advantage over America in fossil fuels. So, you know what we need to do? Instead of caring about that, is maybe if we have alternative energy, we can generate all the energy that we need here without destroying the environment. Oh, but that's not good for our corporations. That's terrible for our corporations, and we can't have that. So you see their perspective is from pro-American corporation and businesses, right? This article is as close to pro-corporate propaganda and fear-mongering disguised as journalism as you can get. The whole point is, don't trust the left. They're being used by the Russians. Fossil fuels and pipelines are amazing and awesome, so don't protest because you're a Russian idiot. So, now look, there are a lot of those on the left who are concerned about the Russiagate narrative. That includes Kyle Kalinske, Ron Placone, Caitlin Johnstone, Mike Figueredo, many, many others. You know why they're concerned? Because of this. This is why they're concerned. The Russian narrative has been weaponized against the left. Now, whether you believe, as I do, that Russia tried to influence the 2016 election, and will try again, the fact is, it's the establishment's, that this is the establishment's plan to try and stop progressive victories in 2018 and 2020 by painting all progressive groups as useful Russian idiots and people who are spread pro-Russian propaganda. And if that does not worry you, then maybe it should. Hey everybody, thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more like this, please hit the subscribe button below. And if you want to support truly independent progressive media, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/TYTNation.